This is just the beginning. That's the world that we live in. Let me help you believe in what we can do when we stand united. We are one with the world. We can make a brighter tomorrow. Together make a change. It's our life. We can't step back from what we know is right. So let's shine our light. Oh, let's shine our light. We won't listen to what they're saying. We know it's just love that we're giving to this place that we call our home. We can't change what's been done, but it's still our run. We are one with the world. We can make a brighter tomorrow.
Hello, everybody. Warm welcome and thank you for joining us today. This session is to unite social entrepreneurs from all around the globe to discuss collaborative solutions for climate impact. And before we start with this amazing session, I would like to welcome you all to the Catalyzing Change Week through a short video.
Hi, I'm Sanjoy Roy, the co-chair of the Catalyzing Change Week Programming Committee. Welcome to CCW 2024. This is where you'll meet social innovators, change makers, folks from government and from bilateral agencies. And of course, this is the place to look at best practices, share ideas and innovations, and enjoy networking with each other. Welcome to the session. Hi.
Wonderful. Just sharing some housekeeping rules before we start. If possible, kindly keep your video on if you have the bandwidth to do so. Show your name and organization, and also it will be nice if you can introduce yourself in the chat. Please put your questions in the chat as well, or in the Q&A. And raise your hand if you wish to speak. If you face any technical problems, please reach out to me. And the most important thing, enjoy the session. Thanks, and over to Meenakshi to kick us off. You're on mute.
Thank you, Lana. And a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everyone who's joining in this session. It is, as the song says, a new time, a new light for all of us. And I am Meenakshi Gupta. I'm joining in from India, from Delhi. And this session, as the title says, is about some of us, social entrepreneurs, social innovators coming together to have a deep dive conversation about climate emergencies and how we can collaborate with each other and with other members and intermediaries to bring a different impact, a deeper impact, a more comprehensive attention to climate emergencies and the impact it's having on people all across the globe. I wanted to hold this session with a sense of urgency that climate emergencies are bringing to each of the communities and people that we work with in different countries. I have with us today my co-panelists from Brazil, from South Africa, from US, from when we were actually kind of trying to map where we were, each one of us was, and we could see that we were coming from all over the globe. And that's the most heartening thing about being part of Catalyst 2030 and being part of these conversations, that now we have the ability to connect and collaborate. So welcome everyone. And I I want to just say that I am a little nervous holding this conversation, but I am hopeful that with all of you, there will be some joy and some meaning that we are able to get out of this conversation. I just wanted to share uh, some thoughts, some gaps, some systemic patterns that we've been noticing here in India. And we have been at Goonj, the organization that I am from, we have been working on disasters for the past 2+ decades. And we've noticed some systemic gaps, some narrative gaps that I wanted to share with you. It obviously would be very different in different countries and different contexts, but there are some common themes which are emerging across the world, which I guess would need a different kind of interpretation and attention with all of us putting our mind to it. Lana, if you can get us started on the slide about the systemic gaps that we've been talking about. Next. So just three, 4 points that I wanted to share with all of you. One, we come to see disasters as a big emergency or a big event which happens, whether it is a flood or a earthquake or a cyclone. But it is increasingly becoming clear to us with climate change that these are not aberrations anymore. These are not one-off things. They are becoming a inherent part of our human life. And therefore, how we are imagining them or how we are thinking of them, even as we go about our day-to-day, that needs to be addressed or looked at in a new way. There are a lot of disasters which we've noticed are getting a lot of attention. But there are other disasters, like in India, for example, we notice a lot of forest fires do not get that kind of attention, or droughts do not get that kind of attention, whereas floods, monsoon floods and all do get some attention, but some disasters seem to be getting more attention than others just because some of them are more visible, some of them get more media attention. For different reasons, some disasters are finding more visibility, but others are not, whereas a big number of population is getting affected all the same. And in many cases, these disasters are triggering other disasters in those geographies, which again are not finding that kind of visibility or attention or resources. The second part is, of course, about some inherent flaws, and I think my co-panelists will all delve further into this. But these disasters are more like consequences, but the root causes are somewhere else. And the consequences also in terms of how we then connect with people who are affected by these disasters, people like us, who then are becoming victims of charity and aid, and their sense of agency, their sense of dignity is getting diminished in many ways. And those issues really then affect the impact of any relief and rehabilitation and further mitigation work as well over a period of time. I don't need to further state about the exploitation of nature or the social inequity of these disasters. People who are already marginalized, already facing poverty and other big challenges are the worst affected. We all know that. There is the flaw in the transactional and reactive nature of some of the approaches which are taken up. And many a time, standardization of solutions. We've often talked about, national level responses, but in the context of India, if I speak, the diversity of India is such that you cannot possibly have one approach being applied to, the entire geography of India or the entire affected population. And I'm sure that's the case in other contexts as well. Slow and unequal response, resource deployment is probably the most urgent issue, because by the time a disaster happens in one geography and we bring in the relief, the issue of resource deployment, rapidness of that resource deployment is a critical issue. because as social entrepreneurs, we've noticed in India at least that, at one hand, you are doing the relief work, the last mile work. On the other hand, you have to actually go and stamp for the resources to be deployed. So it's inadequate at many times. It is slow in the deployment, and the treatment of the disaster affected people is something which calls for much more attention. So in a nutshell, I'm talking about gaps which are there in terms of resources, creativity, collaborative efforts, innovation in ideas, and most of all, compassion and dignity for the people. I'll stop here, and I will now go to my fellow panelists here and ask, maybe start with Susanna from Brazil. Susanna, what is your reaction to what I've just said? Of course, these are overarching things. They do not surface in the same way in different contexts. They're all different. So going back to your work, and if you can kindly introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and your work, and respond to some of these things that you've seen and how they are in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Nishka, and all the panelists, and thank you all for being here and listening to us. It's a pleasure, and I believe in Catalyst in a way that it can really launch collaboration. So I'm happy to be here. My name is Susanna Pado. I'm one of the founders, together with my husband, of an organization in Brazil called IP, Institute for Ecological Research, which began straightforward to biodiversity conservation. And we soon found out that conservation is a very complex issue, and we could not stick to only one line of thinking and acting. So we broadened our scope in almost a systemic way to include local people and encouragement of new initiatives so that they could improve their livelihoods, education in a very strong sense, up to the policies. So how do you plan a region so that it can be sustainable and have more equity in terms of social justice, and influence policies to help all this that we were putting together. In terms of the disasters, we are facing more and more, and in a more intense and frequent way. And right now, as we speak, there is a terrible, terrible flood in southern Brazil, with more than 100 people dead. And the whole state, 80% of the state is underwater. This had never happened in the intensity that is going on. So, Nishka, my point, probably the most important point that I can bring is that there's a gap of communication between science. Science knows. I mean, in 75, there was one of the first ecologists of Brazil. He was already pointing to the danger of his state, Rio Grande do Sul, in the south of Brazil, to the way that nature was being treated and the forests were being devastated, especially the ones around the rivers, the ones that are protecting from the water. And he wasn't heard. And we see that science is not heard. And usually the priorities go to where money goes and where there are short-term. Science needs long-term, needs investments, needs attention. And my point is that collaboration must be science-based, maybe with the science that you have now. So you don't need to prove that you're right, but what does science indicate? And so if we are courageous enough, brave enough to have these measures that are indicated to be the most appropriate, we will avoid a great deal of suffering. My country now is the whole country is thinking of how to help these people, and this could have been avoided. So in terms of Catalyst, we are in an international arena. So how can we bring this? Because one thing that you said is the difference between what some parts of the world can do when something happens. And in the poorer countries, and Brazil is not exactly poor, but it's in terms of distribution of wealth, it is. And so it is still in the developing stages, in many ways, very, very poor. So we take a long time to put together something so dramatic. But in the first world, everything is solved in 3-4 months. And I'm exaggerating just to make the point, but this is one of the things that we need really to think about. It's one planet. We are here together. And I think Catalyst should remind us of this all the time. It is one planet. My interests are together with all the interests of the people who are here. So I hope I have somehow shared some good thoughts.
Thank you, Susanna. Patrick, I'll come to you now. I think you're working in South Africa, and you are leading on a crowdfunding platform, and your work is trying to sort of spread it out among the masses and spread it out to a larger group. What are your thoughts on what patterns you're seeing, some of the aspects that I spoke about earlier, and what Susanna has added to it, to highlight from your perspective?
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Meenakshi, and Susanna. Also, it's as you said, unfortunately, we tend to turn a blind eye to looming disasters until they're upon us, and not listen to those people who see into the future as to where it's going. You know, it's this topic of looking, how we can come together to collaborate to both mitigate and address climate change or climate impact, let's say, it's something, it's something that does not happen passively. And you spoke just now around how Catalyst 2030 as an organization network could be powerful in addressing this. And I'm actually going to post, there's as Thunder Fund and as BackerBuddy, two of the leading crowdfunding platforms across, in South Africa and Southern Africa. What we've done or been involved in over the last 10 years is working with numerous different organizations, some of the biggest disaster relief organizations in Africa, like Gift of the Givers. We are their primary partners to help them raise the resources they need to both mitigate against future disasters, and also when things go down, to help them raise the resources that they need to address those impacts that come out the other side. And so we've developed a very intimate knowledge as to and actually what you spoke about just now in terms of how often there is a disconnect or dysfunction in terms of the actual deployment of resources post a disaster, which needs to be addressed. One of the biggest things that we've seen is that human nature is very activated by disaster. There was a comment here about, how do we address and ensure, to prevent the post-war disasters that are going to come from these various wars that are happening and looming. And we've seen humans respond when there's a disaster, and then very quickly they forget about it. And that's a problem, because we are driven by this kind of sort of like response to do something, and then we move on. As an example, in Cape Town, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a massive water shortage. And there was a whole thing globally about Cape Town was going towards day zero when the water would stop flowing. The fact that we live by the sea didn't mean anything, but anyway, okay, forget that. But everyone was very organized, and there were platforms being set up to coordinate relief efforts and so forth. 5 years later, funding was gone. Everything had dried up. Interest had dried up, and that is a repeating cycle when it comes to disasters. And a lot of what climate impact mitigation that we're looking at it's driven by these more and more frequent disasters. So I'm just posting into the message group. This is something that when the water issues happened in Cape Town, we got together 4 or 5 different organizations who were all involved in addressing this crisis, the water crisis. and said, can we not come together as a committee or a grouping of disaster mitigation or disaster focused organizations to build a sustainable response system to address disaster relief, and in this case, as we're talking about climate impact. And what we started looking around the world at who's doing this kind of work. And one of the most success we've seen is this group in the UK called the Disasters Emergency Committee. And they are a collective of about 15 of the biggest relief organizations based out of the UK, but they work globally. And they look to, and this is the thing, rather than fight human nature, they work with human nature, i.e., when there is a disaster, that's when they go to say, right, let's engage the humans, who we are, to actually focus their attention on this so that we can build a long-term resource base to address these issues wherever they are in the world. And I thought that was a really interesting way and effective way to actually engage in this. Because on the ground, we, as BackaBuddy and the partners and so forth, we deal with crisis as such. But we all know if we're going to be effective in addressing climate impact on a long-term basis, it has to be a sustainable engagement. And that brings me back to where we are here in this group today, in that there is the opportunity for, I think, for us as catalysts to self-select into a grouping that will look to keep this on the agenda over the longer term. And I'd almost see this conversation as one of those kind of sort of starting sparks to maybe get that going. Maybe I'll pause there for a moment and actually come back to you.
Thank you, Patrick. I will take that particular strand of conversation because we've done something similar. But before I speak about that, I wanted to come back to Winthrop quickly. Winthrop, you have looked at it from the other side. You've been part of many networks of donors, of organizations and funders who have been looking at some of the climate action work or climate-related funding. What has been your observation around these aspects and gaps that I've spoken about in a broad sense? If you can kind of put a light on that.
Yes, sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Winthrop Carty, and I'm based in the college town of Cambridge, Massachusetts in the US. It's great to be here with you. So what's interesting, Meenakshi, is that I think all three of you, Susanna, Patrick, and Meenakshi, really kind of already touched on exactly what the challenges are vis-a-vis sort of funders and sort of the dynamic between funders and communities and grantees and so forth, so-called beneficiaries. I think I'll start with the late, great psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who passed away a couple of weeks ago and won the Nobel Prize for Economics, even though he's a psychologist, because he basically created the field of behavioral economics. I heard him in an interview say, if I were to design an experiment that spoke specifically to the core human biases and limitations, it would be climate change, because we as humans inherently are reactive to threats when they happen and are upon us. So the whole short-term way of thinking, climate is complex. Susanna talked about the science. It's very hard to translate these incredibly complex scientific information into something that is digestible for people to buy into. So that kind of gets to, I think, what Patrick was saying about the kind of reactive nature of climate. And so specifically when we come to kind of what I've learned working with funders and having it in some junctures, having been a funder myself, with organizations that fund, I think we can say that the short-termism is definitely a huge problem. So the classic model for funding is, okay, we're going to give you a grant. We want to see these very specific outcomes that are attributable to the money we're giving you, and you're going to give us a report in 3 years on your on how many wells you've dug or whatever it is. It's highly tangible. And is something that you can create in a short term and can be reported on. And when we're talking about climate change and climate response, disaster response, and prevention. And if we're talking about funding, that just is a huge disconnect, right? So the discussions I've been in around this with funders and in funder communities is trying to get more buy-in around the notion of kind of emergent outcomes and ones that are not necessarily attributable to one grant maker or funder or government. So the way I like to coin it is systemic problems need systemic approaches, right? And what we've designed in the way that governments and philanthropists fund, it's usually according to these very traditional vertical field-based, so you've got your environmental program, you've got your health program, and the funding is kind of all channeled through these verticals when we're talking about something that's truly systemic and complex, right? So again, the complexity comes in as well. So what we are starting to see is, in these discussions, I'm sure most of us have been in them about kind of trust-based philanthropy, the longer term being less sort of that short-term thinking approaches, but that's like, turning the Titanic around. It takes a long time for those changes to happen. And meantime, we're dealing with the very specific challenges that the three of you brought up. I was really, Meenakshi, you talked about transactionalism and being reactive, and certainly, Suzanne and Patrick talked about that reactive as opposed to being proactive. And the slow response times is also a huge. So I think we'll talk later about collaboration. I think the slow response time that Meenakshi talked about is key, because what happens with the disasters, and we've all seen this and heard this, is the disaster happens and the international community comes in and wants to help, right, for the reasons that I think, Patrick, you mentioned in terms of sort of human nature being sort of responding in the moment to the crisis. And then everyone's scrambling around, like, who are the actors? Who do we give the money for? Who do we collaborate with? And there's no kind of social capital infrastructure in place. And I think it'll be interesting, Patrick, you work in that area of social capital building and measuring it and seeing how that can be deployed more proactively to sort of build those networks of collaboration such that, including funders, such that when we have to cope with disasters, the kind of the human and institutional network infrastructure is already organically in place and can respond much more efficiently and over a longer term. So Meenakshi, maybe I'll stop there so that everyone has a chance to sort of chime in.
Thank you for talking about the urgency and the need for collaboration in this area. I just wanted to also, because as social entrepreneurs, our muscle is not just, in terms of deliberating about problems, but also doing something about them, and just starting to share a little bit about what we are doing or have been doing in India, and how that has been emanating from the space of collaboration at a systemic level, at a societal level. We started, as I said earlier, working on disasters because we were doing actually development work in far-flung rural communities of India, and we kept on noticing and we kept on working on various disasters hitting these communities and us having to respond to that disaster. And that kept on being a cycle which went on and on every year. So it came to back to zero, and then you start again, and then again there's a So it is a painful experience to see all the work that you've done with the community go down to zero again and again and again. And while on the other hand, there's a urban India or the giving India or the other part of the country or the world, which was trying to be helpful at the time of a disaster. But as Patrick said, with short memories and short cycles, it would just go away after a while. And then it would come back again when another disaster happens. So that cycle is something that we notice happening time and again. So we what we've done over the years is we've tried to build a network of multi-sectoral organizations coming together, and a network which works in non-disaster time, and that network connecting to each other in urban India and in rural India, which is the most vulnerable part. But now, to be honest, I think there's no part of India which is left out. I think every part of the world has become a vulnerable place. But the idea being that we are not just looking at, and Patrick, you were talking about, disaster sector organizations coming together, but we've kind of taken the wider view of this in involving many multi-sectoral organizations, from supply chain organizations to transport companies to media to academia and civil society, and that becoming an ongoing community of people who are not just looking outwards in terms of how we are going to be responding to disasters, but also going back to their own work and kind of taking that lens. And that, of course, is a mindset change that one is seeking at a cultural level, at a societal level. So, Lana, if you can bring up the slide of GUARD, and Alan is here, Alan Brathwaite. Thank you for joining in, Alan. He's my co-chair on the Disasters Working Group. And we've spoken often about this, that this is a need for a societal or a rethink about how we are. So this is the idea which has emerged from our systemic work across cities and villages of India. It is a cross-sectoral alliance, that Gunj Alliance for Rapid Response in Disasters. GUARD is an idea which has emerged in India, but it is an idea which can be seeded in Brazil, in South Africa, in any part of the world which has, a whole section of very vulnerable communities, but also funders and other entities who are involved typically in disaster response work and can connect. So idea being three aspects. One is entities of this alliance to pre-commit resources for some very well mapped out disasters like monsoon floods or summer fires and things like that, which you are, as Susanna's point to the science of it being very precise. You know those places are vulnerable. You know those disasters or those emergencies are coming up more often than not. And the idea being that the network is basically working together. In India, we are doing very small things, like we are holding disaster exhibitions where pictures from the disaster area, where we are talking about people who are disaster affected, people like us who are going through some kind of a crisis, but how should we give to them? How mindful and giving of with dignity to those people is an important thing. How we can look at some root causes. So main thing being that we do not do the work of disaster response or any corrections or transformation that we're seeking. We do not do that work only in disaster time or just after a disaster. We do it as a ongoing work with an alliance of multiple stakeholders which come together. And that is something which we believe that it is what is needed at a societal level to make the citizens, make the masses more tuned into not just what the problem is, but also what can they do. So there could be different education being one strand, giving being another strand, collaboration being a third strand. So those are different strands which will emerge from this kind of a network and alliance which can come together. And that is just one of the ideas. I just wanted to share with all of you that this is responding to some of the systemic gaps which are there. And I'm sure there are many aspects to it, but I just wanted to share this one slide, and I'll now ask if Susanna and Patrick would like to share any other ideas which have emerged from your context and how those ideas can have been successful, have worked. And Patrick did talk about the network that he was talking about, the crowdsourcing network as well. If Susanna or Patrick would like to share any ideas emerging from your own context.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Absolutely, Susanna, I'll follow.
Well, thank you, Manish. I think, you know, you work in a large number of places in India, and the reality of where you work is a little bit different from mine. I work, our organization works a great deal in protected areas, in the Amazon, in the Pantanal, in the Atlantic forest. And so near to where nature is more protected, disasters occur less frequently. So people who work in the urban areas, and Brazil is a continental size, so of course there is a great deal of differences all over the country. But in general, these disasters occur in the urban areas, and more frequently at least. And there is an influence of, for example, the system of the Amazon has floating rivers that the currents bring to the south and southeast and the center of Brazil, and provoke the rain system. And when you deforest the Amazon, as we are doing, of course it affects all the rest, even agriculture. And so I truly believe in the system that you pointed out to strengthen, you know, the organizations and so forth. We work in that way, but we work more particularly in interdisciplinary approaches, as you mentioned. That was so important. You all mentioned the multifaceted, and going back to the challenges that I forgot to mention. One for me that is very, very serious is that science is long-term, but politics is very short-term. And so they need responses in 4 years because they want to be reelected. And so this creates a big gap between what is needed in the long term. And Winthrop, you mentioned the long-term funding, which is also very challenging because there is what they call donors fatigue. You know, people get tired of funding the same issue. So, oh, now I want to change to another species, to another region, and so forth. And so, unfortunately, these are complex issues that we have to deal with. In terms of cooperation within our organizations itself, I think it's extremely important because we learn from each other all the time, and we can take the experiences that we have in one region of Brazil to another region of Brazil, or even to abroad, as we are doing here today, right now. So I really believe in what we're doing because I think this is the way. I unfortunately do not have a recipe of how we will get there. I would love to come out of this saying, you know, what is needed is this, but I think we are on the right track to listen to each other and to reflect on what would make a difference. And this is, for me, key. How can we get together to make a difference? And it is now. We are in an urgent moment, as you said, Meniska. So this is what I think right now. And I love the idea of putting together a bunch of organizations in each of our countries that help each other. This is happening, in fact, in Brazil, in the favelas. There are people working in the slums of Brazil, and they, for example, just to give you a positive example, during the pandemic, we all thought that the favelas would succumb, and they helped each other in such an enormous way. They found ways to help each other, and so we need to learn from them. See, and all of this sums, and this is what we need at the moment.
Thank you. Patrick, any thoughts from you about solutions and ideas emerging from your context?
Yeah, absolutely. It is so in terms of I said, like our response to these challenges. Susanna, you're so right. In terms of political structures are built for short-term gain. It's a you have every 4 years it wraps over. I remember listening to, there's a minister of economics or whatever from China, and he was talking, discussing who is going to win in terms of the world of large economies. And he got this really kind of sort of smirk on his face, and he says, "Of course we'll win. We planned 20 years. America, 4 years. They change." Obviously not that accent, but he's absolutely right. I was like, oh, crumbs, he's right. And that's exactly it. It's like the short-termism that we have at a political level is very difficult to deal with. But I believe we've got an answer to that. And that is because in our worlds, as Catalyst 2030 members not, we work as hundreds of smaller organizations who can collaborate very effectively over a longer term. And those organizations like Meenakshi, what you put together there, what I spoke about with the DEC, what we're doing here in South Africa, those are the sustainable solutions that we can put in place, and we can deal with one government after the next. And I do believe that democratic system is a powerful one, and is good for growth. So the more autocratic system of China also has a lot of its benefits, but it's not something I would adhere to personally. So in terms of Catalyst 2030, one thing I'd love to bring to the table is, and we spoke about it previously, was we've been exploring this idea of how do you identify the people who will lead in these kind of initiatives. And it's not necessarily the head of an organization or so forth. It's often people embedded within those organizations who have what we call high social capital. Now, Winthrop, you've spoken, and I know that you have deep knowledge and in this area as well. But it's something I'm relatively new to, and I got very excited about. But I looked at this and I said, when a disaster happens, whether it's in Brazil, South Africa, India, or Canada for that matter, who do you turn to when you need to get that relief there into the community now? And more often than not, it's not the person who heads up an NGO. So it might be your local pastor or your local person who organizes basketball games or whatever it is. If you can identify those people what is social capital? Just as a quick definition for those who may not be sure of it, social capital is built on 3 pillars. 1, how trusted you are in your community. 2, how connected you are. And 3, how strong your shared vision is or shared values. Now think about that. That social capital requires action, historical action, to build up to being trusted, connected, and having shared values. We all know there's some people, when they shout fire, everyone listens and we run. Another person shouts fire and they go like, no, again, he's playing a joke. The first person is the person who has very powerful social capital, and you want those people. Now, I think within this space here, if we are building these networks or organizations that are going to be able to address or mitigate against climate impact when it happens, those are the kind of things that we can focus on. We can identify within our organizations people who are respected, trusted, and connected within our societies. And when things go down, those are the people we turn to. So within Catalyst 2030, I think we definitely look to and should set up formal structures. But then within that, let's try and look to identify those people who, when stuff goes down, we know who to speak to and who to turn to. So I see it as a kind of dual response. We need to engage with government. We need to engage with policy. That's critical. But we also need to recognize that we, as Catalyst 2030, can be really powerful as these many, many small organizations who know who's on the ground, who to speak to. And when the time comes, whether it's Red Cross or Gift to the Givers or the big guys come in and saying like, okay, like we need to do stuff, we can say, well, work with us because we know who on the ground will be the right people to deliver relief and so forth when it's needed.
Thank you, Patrick. That's really it's a great segue to coming back to Winthrop, who also leads on the collabs in Catalyst 2030. And I especially invited him to get us and the three organizations, the three social entrepreneurs in the room, to be talking a little bit of a focusing on how do we collaborate and what are the challenges. So Winthrop, over to you to hold this conversation. I know we're really little short on time, but let's try and make the most of this.
Great.
Second.
Okay, I'll refrain from my long words so that we really dig into the substance that from your experiences. So, Susanna, you said you basically that you need a recipe, right? No recipe for how you sort of catalyze this kind of collaboration to be able to sort of bridge science and communities and policymakers. I think that is a key point. And, certainly Meenakshi and Patrick just raised some very important examples of ingredients into that wonderful recipe that we need to create, right? So I'll maybe frame it from what you all just said on a couple of points. So if we're talking about building collaboration infrastructure and most importantly, people, the ones with the high social capital at all, whether they're funders, policymakers, scientists, community leaders, all the actors who need to be there for us to have a systemic approach to this systemic problem, particularly in a crisis. And so the two things that I would add to what we've talked about so far are the need for backbone support. And that does get back to the funding question, because I know from lots of experience, the vast majority of funders, whether it's public or private, are still reluctant to put in the resources for the backbone support. And by backbone support, I mean, if you're going to be, building the relationships across all of those different members of these different sectors, such that when the situation gets hot, they're not still trying to figure out who's that person, what's this organization, but they already know. You need that backbone support, just like what we do with Catalyst, where we're bringing this kind of heterogeneous hodgepodge global mix of social entrepreneurs and funders and intermediaries all together, and we sort of discover each other and begin to collaborate. And that's thanks to that backbone support. So I think that's one thing that I guess I would, in our discussion in the minute time we have left, is to think, what backbone support have you seen, and what networks, and are they sort of just pop up, have a nice conference, everyone says they're going to collaborate, then they go back to what they're doing because there's nothing to sustain the collaboration, no project funding to get people to kind of work together and get to know each other and build that social capital among each other. And I give one example that I think is really powerful, and this gets to, I was privileged to be part of MIT D-Lab, which really, I think, more than any other organization, came up with participatory design as a model. And the point there was that the design team, if you think of human-centered design, where people are looking at a problem, let's say the water crisis in Cape Town, and how do we think proactively and long-term about it? with participatory design, you wouldn't just be bringing the experts, sort of the water experts and the, you know, the different actors. You'd also be bringing the community members into the process. They're part of the design team. And that becomes the way I like to call it is the process is the product, right? We're building that social capital, and that is very tangible, very important. It's not what funders see. It doesn't fit into a nice 3-year report saying how many water wells you've dug, but that's really important. So I'd be interested in sort of how the three of you have used, and I know you have, you know, participatory processes to be able to engage everybody, those affected, those funding, policy, you know, scientists, everybody together over time, so that you build that trust and that new kind of collaborative infrastructure. So I'd be interested in which one of you would like to sort of talk about some experiences with that.
I can
Go
go
for
and
it.
keep on
Mhm.
use time because we have very less time. So basically, I think some examples from within Catalyst and some from some of the intermediary organizations, some from our work. In Catalyst, of course, the fact that we were able to build a working group around disasters and be able to, of course, you know, disasters is not on the agenda as an issue for most organizations, even as in the membership. But still, it is something which has affected from time to time. I think Alan is here. And we've spoken to many members at the time of a disaster, and we've tried to talk about some of the issues that they're facing, learn from that, try to create peer-to-peer knowledge and idea sharing and all of that happen. The other example which comes to mind is something with Schwab Foundation, and that's how I got to meet Susanna. It was a learning journeys thing that Patrick, myself, and a few others also. We went to Brazil to learn about their work, and other social entrepreneurs in the country on various issues. And Susanna and I connected more on the values. You know, even though we didn't know so much about each other's work, but our values aligned, and our way of looking at development and disaster response work, and our vision of where we see the world going, all of those things align. So, and when we work in India, just coming back to my work or our work in India, we basically don't wait for a disaster to talk to the communities, you know, in the urban communities especially, because we realize that at the time of a disaster, people have to act, whether it is on the ground or whether it is the giver. Everybody has to act very quickly. So if we have to talk anything about the mindset, we have to do the talking or the culture building throughout the year and not at the time of a disaster. So that kind of campaigning, that kind of, you know, communication using the social media, doing articles, and all of those things really need to happen on an ongoing basis to build, and then you attract organizations coming who are aligning on all those things, and that kind of builds a solid network around a certain issue or around a certain disaster, especially to do with certain geographies that people align. So I'll just stop with that, and yeah, some ideas from there.
Great.
Can
So
I?
who's
Can
next?
I?
Susanna.
Yeah.
Yes.
I really would appreciate very much, Manisha, what you just said, and what I think we need to focus on more than disasters is exactly what Minchka just mentioned. That is the prevention of it. We need to think of ways to cooperate before the disasters occur. So one thing that we did in our organization, when we began, we were working in one of the most conflicting regions of Brazil. It's called the Pontal do Paranapanema. It's the western portion of São Paulo, and there were a lot of landless people occupying the land. We were working to save a very endangered species of monkey, but how important is a monkey in face of thousands of people to occupy their use? And so there was a great with collective goals. How did we do this? Through what we call eco negotiations, participatory meeting, of course, but one agrees in certain ways. So I believe that we need somehow to get to that point and to prevent disasters. And then there is real collaboration. And just to end, because we're almost there, I just want to mention how education is important. We need to change the way we educate people. Instead of competitiveness, we need to work on cooperation and to include empathy, include involvement. How can we make people care? And then I think this would be the biggest cooperation and the biggest step that we could give to prevent disasters. We would all look at others with looking at their values and with love instead of greed and competitiveness.
Beautiful. Patrick, I guess you want to chime
in? From my side, it's firstly just going back to what Meenakshi was talking about, how critically important it is to work cross sector. That we've seen is so working with organizations like Gift of the Givers that are focused on disaster relief gives a kind of central point from which to support. But in terms of it's great to see Alan here as chair of the Catalyst Working Group on transforming disaster management. If one is going to create sustainable engagement, you have to have a formal organization through which you can channel that support and those funds. So Winthrop, you spoke about how do you sustain that backbone? You've got to create a formal structure. And that's what we saw is that something like the DEC in the UK, that's what they did. And I think what we've got with Catalyst 2030 is, yes, we're moving to more the formalization of the organization through the 501c in the US and so forth. And that will give us the capacity to hold those resources to then resource this kind of work. So it's exciting to be part of this of an organization that is actually building solutions. So you can't just move directly to a solution, because often in the beginning it's then dysfunctional or not well tuned to what's required. It's through this kind of engagement that we'll get there, and this kind of dialogue. So we recognize the need. We've looked at what other organizations are doing in the world. Then what makes us different as Catalyst 2030 in terms of what we can bring to the party? Maybe we're not the organization that is going to engage with top government and so forth. There's much bigger foundations that are going to do that. But we have thousands of individual members who can work collaboratively together on a global basis to both create a sustained engagement and also, when required, have many organizations locally for when there's a disaster. Like Susanna now, I'm sure there's Catalyst 2030 members in Brazil who would be able to speak to and engage directly with the relief that is required or to look to mitigate impact facing those post the floods and so forth. So it is. I think we definitely bring something new to the landscape as an organization, and it's great to see the formalization of these groups to address it, because that is it. You've got to form an initial network, then you've got to create an underlying institutional structure that can hold that backbone, and then we can get on with the work.
Thank you. I thank you so much, everyone. I know this conversation could not have been kind of wrapped up or come to a conclusion in 1 hour. We know that better than anyone else, but I do hope that this conversation becomes just the first step in having deeper conversations for collaboration. We invite you to join the Disasters Working Group. I'm hoping to have a deeper conversation with all of you, Winthrop, Susanna, Patrick. And going forward, I think, as Patrick rightly said, there are hundreds of organizations who will be needed to be responding to the growing calamities which are coming to different parts of the world. So hooray to the collaborative force that we can be. And thank you very much from the depth of my heart for joining in today. It is a very special conversation, very important conversation, and one that we will hope to continue going forward. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.